As we start, I have one question to the group up here. Let's assume you are a Chinese negotiator and you see Brexit happening and you have doubts about Europe. You've bought some German companies, you've tried to buy into the port of Piraeus, but because you're low-hanging fruit, you pick on the Greeks. Would you now pick on the British, and how? Michael.
If I were the Chinese investor.
Yes.
Well, if this really...
Just hold it closer.
If this really happens, I think I would buy into the British market. I mean, again, you have to diversify, and things are, if things are happening if they happen the way I don't want them to happen, it's good to have your foot in there as well, because, and the downside for Europe is that Britain could actually do well, and I think a good Chinese investor would want to have his foot in that market as well. But again, now I get to say something personal. I don't think they're going to do it, so I'm going to be provocative. I think this is such a Herculean task that some politician is going to organize another vote, and it's going to be, maybe the whole parliament will be re-elected. This has never happened, I think. Parliament resigns and puts itself up for re-election, and it's a vote on Brexit as well. I think that's the honorable way to do it, instead of some campaign based on a bunch of lies, to do the thing properly and let people really express their views, including those in Scotland. And that would be like the second chance. And I think the Brits deserve a second chance to make a stand for Europe.
Dan.
Michael, that assumes that there is a reasonable opposition party in the UK right now, okay? And, you vote in the UK, I don't, but can the Labour Party function in a reasonable way, Alan, in anything like this?
Gosh, this is getting personal. Parliament can't dissolve itself. That's not what Parliament does. The government can dissolve Parliament, except that we do have had a recent law about 5-year parliaments, which requires a vote of no confidence in the government. So in other words, essentially, the government has got to fail in one way or the other. I think there's clearly a positive probability that we won't go ahead with it, but I think it's probably fairly small. So if I was the Chinese investor, I would wait, because I think the price will be lower in 2 years' time. Now, I don't want to prejudge, not least because you're recording it, I don't want to prejudge the notion that in 15 years we might decide, Brexit was a shot in the arm, a breath of fresh air, and here we are, we're doing wonderfully. But the next few years are going to be really tough, really depressing, really uncertain. So the price, I think, for buying bits of Britain will be down 2-3 years from now.
But they're already down 20%.
Exactly so. There's a lot further to go.
No, I look at this myself. I took a job in England 4 years ago when the pound was $1.60. It's now 1.21. I've suffered a 25% decline in my salary in 4 years. And the interesting thing, of course, everything that any economist who does any research in this area would say is, with the exchange rate being so bad, prices are going to start rising for the British consumer. And we saw that Unilever last week announced it's raising the prices of lots of its consumer products. And, that's going to make people in England think a little bit about what they did, I hope.
No, sure. But that, it seems to me, is exactly the message that we get, why deep down, markets and people in general through the markets are indicating that Brexit is likely to be pretty costly. Sterling is, as you say, it's my salary as well, even though I spend some of it, not most of it, in Britain. But the other thing is, the FTSE 100 is at record levels in terms of sterling, but it's 7% down in terms of dollars. And only apparently 30% of the FTSE 100 earnings come from sterling, come from Britain. So if what's happening in Britain is enough to drive the average price down by 7%, people must be very, very pessimistic about what's happening in Britain.
May I join? I think if you look at Chinese investments in Europe in general over the last 10 to 15 years, they are buying a lot into interesting assets in the UK, in real estate, in hotels and services, in Germany into manufacturing, in France into IT and so on. Usually Chinese investors take a very long-term view and they are guarded by their political masterminds, and usually they get agreement for deals. Now, if you look at the situation right now, there's too much political uncertainty to make a long-term judgment call, but maybe 2 years from now you have the clarity and the transparency of the political process you might need. And maybe at that point in time, asset prices are really bargain basement cheap, right? And I think that's the point in time when Chinese investments might make a big difference to the question whether you get some upside or not. If you get a hard Brexit, there is no reason to invest into manufacturing except for the case that you produce for the Asian market and you think that you have a good trading relationship, but not for typical production out of the UK for the single market. Now, it will be very interesting to see what happens to the Chinese investor who is already invested into the UK, who sees a large suffering on his assets. You know, and you can't sell because you will then realize losses. So this is really tough, and I think it will also depend on Chinese government, asset management companies, and so on, who have British, bonds on their books and look at the pound sterling and think, well, it's nice that the renminbi is now part of the international monetary system, but what happened to the pound and what happens to my portfolio and so on. I think it's a very mixed picture depending on at what type of investor you're looking. Typically, the Chinese plan for rejuvenating the innovation strength of the Chinese economy is looking at technology solutions that they can buy right now. Now, Britain has a couple of industries in which there is quite a lot of high tech based on British universities and so on. So that might be interesting assets that might depreciate for a couple of years and might be targets for M&A deals rather than real estate, hotels and so on as in the past.
It seems to me when I was in London last that all the big business issues aside, London really is one of the Chinese favorite places to exit from China as very rich individuals. In Berlin we have the issue with people powering down Tauentziehen. They're not exactly Chinese, but you have that in London a lot with very large sport cars, and all the old quarters of Chelsea and all the pricey places are empty, not because they rented out to be Airbnb and nobody's coming, but because it's people from the Gulf and from China and Hong Kong who own all these places. So I think the revenge of the colonials has already happened in the British capital. Michael just talked about the US integrating the country through national regulation. That is true. But it is very much a historic, or at this point I would argue, after having lived in Washington for too long, a dated view of things. So my thesis to you, Dan, is that the biggest thing that's happening in the United States is that large corporations, instead of wanting one national standard on many issues, environment, many health insurance and so on, are moving back towards state regulation because they feel that they can influence the state regulators of insurance systems and so on much more. So in that sense, is it false to say that the United States internally does something like an Integrexit, I mean exiting from the national integration, and therefore is a little bit like the UK and we therefore have a special relationship?
I think the question is, what is the cause and what is the effect? Assuming what you say is right about this disintegration, is that happening because companies are doing it or because the government in Washington for the last large number of years has been unable to do very much at all? Nonetheless, we still have not dismantled environmental regulations. Indeed, in the last 8 years, we put in other regulations like the Consumer Product Commission, Safety Commission, which I think is very beneficial. So I think the trend is still very much upward, still toward the internalizing of the externalities of regulations of this sort. So I'm more optimistic about this than you seem to be. I don't see that kind of disintegration going on.
I'm always looking for the bright side. The bright side then is that the British people should look at the United States that is fighting against lengthened odds to keep the country together. And that's a very positive thing. I interrupted Klaus and then Alan.
I think you raised the issue, what are the broader political repercussions of Britain leaving the European Union. And I think that's much more important than just thinking about the consequences for energy policy or climate change or anything, any of these topics, because it pertains to many more areas. And I must state clearly, I think, that for Germany, this is a loss of a political partner in many, many debates inside Europe that is very, very deplorable. For the simple reason that the key task we still face in Europe is to build economically speaking, a United States of Europe for the digital economy, for energy, for the capital markets, for banking, for all the things that the US actually achieved somewhere between 1890 and 1930. And if you look at the fragmentation we have today in European markets for telecommunication, for data rules, for energy companies, you don't have really a single market in many of these fields yet. And the Brits have been a constant force of making this happen, of promoting policies, supporting the creation of a single market. Fortunately, no matter what the political color of the government in the UK was, I think that was a constant, maybe with slight variations, but a constant point. And I think the divorce creates the risk that for one point, of course, the single market will be smaller because more than 60 million people will leave it. But for the second point is more important. The political argument for creating it has become weaker as well because the benefits will not be as large, and the traditional partners who think this is a good idea have become weaker, and the forces of protection become stronger. And so I think the political repercussions over the longer term require some hard thinking on part of the remaining European states how to cope with climate policies, single market policies, the development of the digital economy much more constructively than before. On climate change and resource use and so on, the British have been rather good performance in the European Union, because they adopted early on pretty tough climate policies. They tried at least to build up renewables. They were a little bit slow on that. But in terms of emission performances and participation in the European trading scheme for emissions and so on, they have been a good performer. Now, if they leave, we have to fix the problem what to do with the remaining system and how to adjust it. And again, the number of member states that have a poor record of reducing climate emissions is increasing, and their relative weight is increasing. So we are losing a very important partner on very modern climate change policies, on single market policies, on the digital economy, on foreign trade as well. The British have been very important partners in getting TTIP and all the other trade initiatives of the European Union going. Now, the point of leaving is somewhat strange, at a time when we have almost finalized now a deal with Canada and are in the midst of a negotiation with the United States. It's difficult. We lose our British interlocutor between the two continents, which is a pity.
Michael, Klaus raised two important points with regard to Germany. He said Germany is losing a very important partner, and he talked about a lot of areas of policy. I want to focus on the core point, market economic thinking, and have you address that head on. And unlike Klaus, who can't be polite or very outspoken about that, most likely for certain institutional reasons, do the Germans have the balls to really, is it in the German nature that they can become strong market economy advocates against, a coalition of Mr. Tsipras, Mr. Renzi, and assuming the French miraculously stay with the government they have, which is not likely at this point. But can the Germans get this done? Is it in their DNA, or are we going to be, without the British prop, lost in the sea of market economy thinking?
I would rather pass on one of those comments, but I think it's clear that Germany has had in the European sense, a liberal ally, a free market, pro-free market ally. If you look at the World Bank ratings on doing business, the UK comes out very, very high. I think only maybe Denmark does better. And Germany is actually Zweite Liga, second league. So Germany actually can look up to Britain as being, sort of, they've been very dynamic, and it's easy to start a company, it's easy to close a business, it's easy to get credit. The only thing that Germany does better than the UK is getting electricity to the companies.
So Germany's performance on doing business is as good as the English national team in soccer.
I won't comment on that either. But the important thing is losing this ally means that Germany is very isolated, because the recipe for Southern Europe is more market. These are also very statist-run places, or highly regulated economies. And if you really think the Greek economy needs a shot in the arm, it needs more free enterprise. They need to privatize some businesses. They need to give people freedom. They need to have investor rights. They need to do all sorts of things that British do for breakfast every day. And the Germans will not be able to convince the rest of Europe if they're by themselves. Maybe Alan has a...
Before we get to Alan, because he's long overdue a turn, but the other point that Klaus said at the end, almost as a throwaway remark, I thought was very fundamental, when he said, well, we're losing the UK as an interlocutor. And I want to question that in the following way. Is it wise for one of the world's largest economies, Germany, and Europe's leading economy, at this day and age, and let me put it pointedly, 70 years after World War II and Germans really having come a long way, is it wise if we continue to depend on an interlocutor, or should we start being able to speak our own mind without, one picks up a phone call, one doesn't need anybody in London. This is the reverse of the Henry Kissinger argument, tell me the phone number for Europe and I'll dial it any time. It seems absurd to me, though true, so I'm not questioning how you described it, but I think it's a prop that we must shed because it doesn't do anybody in Germany any good.
Fair enough, but I don't think Germany has the heart for the British position. I think Germany lets, as we say in America, do the interference, run the blocking to get the guy across the football, across the goal line. I don't think that, since Erhard, we haven't really had super advocates for free markets. But the German economy is happy when someone runs interference for them, and I think that's one of the jobs the UK has done quite well.
And I liked the fact that you did give me the answer to my question, although you modified it slightly on language. I asked, do the Germans have the balls? And you answered by saying the Germans don't have the heart. Alan, your turn.
I've forgotten what I was going to say.
Oh.
but let me comment on the role of the UK in Europe. I think if it is the case that Brexit is going to lead to disintegration within Europe, that will be at the cost of the UK as well. It is something which was very regrettably in our referendum campaign actually advanced almost as a positive, that this would shake the Europeans up and it will fall apart. There were a number of people who thought that would be a good thing. This is, I think, rather as Dan has suggested, among the most appalling, short-sighted attitudes that there is. I'm not so sure that the Brits, losing the Brits will change a great deal in the way that Europe functions. I have to say, my impression as a Brit looking in is that very often they were not terribly influential, precisely because we were petulant and sometimes kicking the door while the grown-ups were talking inside would get something done. But actually, Britain was never very good at projecting its views and its culture so far as the European Union was concerned. Now, for many Brits, that perhaps is part of the Brexit issue. These guys aren't like us, and we are great after all, and we'll go our own way. I have to say, for myself, I felt exactly the opposite. I've always felt that the European Union was actually a rather useful agent of restraint on British politics. To have someone on the outside who said, we'll let you do it, but it'll take you 3 or 4 years of hard negotiating and thinking hard about something before you can. I worry a great deal, actually, that the Brits, once they are on the outside, are cut loose of all restraint, and it will end up, it could end up in tears. Now, again, I am not saying this is what will happen, but it does seem to me that when you look at the British system, which is a very particular form of democracy, There is nothing that a House of Commons basically cannot do on a wet Thursday afternoon when it is so moved. And, in a sense, creating a referendum, Brexit is an example of that. So I think there is a political loss flowing back the other way as well.
I just want to say to the audience, congratulations to the gentleman who asked the question. It triggered quite a bit of debate. So I hope somebody else right now who has a question, please.
Michael's egging. Is this on?
We hear you, yeah.
All right. I know that this is a panel on the economic consequences of Brexit, and I'm an economist myself, so I think it's great that we have a panel like this. But let me ask a slightly different question, which has troubled me not as an economist, but at a personal level, which is the following. It's not terribly surprising to me, given the amount of misinformation regarding the economic consequences of Brexit, that the economic calculations would have been wrong or misguided. So, that seems somewhat unsurprising to me. But another reading, and again, I'm no expert in the matter at all, but something that you read in the press is the role of xenophobia in all of this. And sitting in Europe, and here's my question. I've sometimes worried sitting in Germany, suppose that we'd had that level of misinformation regarding economic consequences of a Dexit, whatever you want to call it, Germany exiting. If people had been allowed a referendum here, and supposing that the media is right, that xenophobia had some role to play in Britain's decision, would we see the same kind of outcome in other European countries, Germany in particular, because of these non-economic motivations for this particular vote, xenophobia in particular?
Mike.
That's a tough one.
That's why it's to you.
Yeah. I was surprised how quickly the Alternative für Deutschland just came out of nowhere. And a colleague of mine, one of our students, actually founded that party as an anti-Euro party. It was only about the Euro. It was a very technocratic grouping. And it got hijacked. It got shanghaied by people who felt strongly about other issues, xenophobic issues. And suddenly, of course, we knew about Pegida and Dresden and all the rest. So there's something, in every country. There's a dark spirit in every country. It's a genie that you don't want to let out of the bottle. So I'm also concerned, but I think Germany has a real culture of first talking about these things in the open. I think something maybe lacking in the United States right now. People talking at each other but not talking with each other. And I think Germans still have a very strong view about what happened 70 years ago, which is fortunate. Okay, people have not forgotten. They've passed it on to their children. I'm married to a German woman, and this is quite clear from my discussions with them.
Dan.
Well, I'm not so sure I would be as negative about this in the U.S. I mean, I think as much as I despise Trump, he is channeling about 25% or more of the population who are deeply unhappy, which is not so different from the AfD, and I think it's a lot of the same reasons. And I would rather have it channeled and discussed, and it is being discussed. I mean, I think Hillary's right. His deplorables is a perfectly reasonable term, but at least we're talking about it. The question is, just as it is here, what's going to happen afterwards? I don't think these people are going to take over the government in the U.S. or here, but somehow we have to deal with these things, lest if we head toward a serious recession, these things will, as they did in the early 30s, get worse. That's the biggest loss. That's the biggest fear. And I think we have it in the open. I think people who are in Washington realize this, and I believe they are thinking about what to do, as I assume the centrist parties here, which is the majority of the parties, is as well. So I'm more optimistic that it's available. The question is, how do you solve it? How do you deal with it? How do you make these people happy if they can be made happier?
That's globalization for you, two Americans debating the peacefulness of German society. Alan.
Yeah, so let me make a couple of comments on this. I mean, one, referenda are very bad ways of taking decisions about serious and subtle and nuanced issues. And Well, essentially, yes. A democracy is not about elections, really. Elections are a tiny bit of democracy. Most of democracy is about talking and compromising and recognizing the other guy will be in power. Now, not being an expert on German constitution, I don't know, but my impression is that power is much more diffuse within Germany. There is much more built-in consultation. And therefore, in that respect, you're less likely to trip over, exactly as Britain did, one single short-sighted, short-term bit of political trickery, and we have a referendum. It turns out we're going to leave the EU as a result of that. I don't think that's the way the German system works. The other thing I would say, and I've not articulated this in public before, but since the referendum in Britain, I've begun to say to myself, a little bit of repression is not a bad thing. And what I mean by that is not political repression. I mean, the referendum result seems to have legitimized unpleasant xenophobic behavior in Britain. People who on June the 20th would have thought, I can't be nasty to that person, thought on June the 25th, I can be, it's okay. And that is, I think, partly a generational thing, which the Germans mercifully, precisely because of the legacy of 70 years ago, have not advanced as far as the Brits. The Brits, frankly, have forgotten self-control. And that, I think, is a worry.
It's more subtle than that, though. Yes, they may well have, in a trend line, forgotten self-control. But a vote like this legitimizes the exercise of a loss of self-control, just as we've seen upticks in bullying in the United States. We've seen upticks in what is really outrageously sexist behavior triggered by the acceptance of a large part of the population of Donald Trump. Individuals do matter, and they do legitimize antisocial behavior. We've seen that in both countries for the same reasons, albeit we haven't had a referendum.